So to fix that, we have a thing called a SOP solver, or in SOP parlance, just solver. So solver is a very bare bones DOP network that's actually inside of it. If you double click to go inside, you can see we actually jumped in several stages. So that right inside the solver node is just a DOP network called D. And inside that, there is a bare bones setup, which is just an empty object, an initial geometry, and then the SOP solver, which we've used in a lot of other Applied Houdini lessons. But basically all this is another SOP area, geometry, but that is done in terms of the previous frame. So we can evolve a solution over many frames. So what do we want in here? Well, we want to move that thing that we just came up with in here. So I'm going to grab this, cut it, paste it here. So in terms of the previous frame, and then choose this second input here, not the first input. And we'll put this here now. So on the first frame, it's going to start from this static geometry, which on the first frame, the previous frame will be. And put the second input here. That will be this, as you can see. So now that will happen in here. Now the issue here is that this still won't quite work. If I were to run this simulation, such as it is, well, I have to turn simulations back on first. If I were to run this, it still isn't quite right. Also, it looks like our this broke, as you can see with the exclamation point, because our relative references aren't correct anymore. So that's an argument for using absolute references sometimes. I'm sorry, everyone. There we go. So that works again, but more to the point, it's still overwriting everything every frame. Because this node, the Wrangler node, is saying on every frame that for every point, find out if you're inside right now. So instead, we should say, don't just be whether you are wet or not. Be whatever is bigger, whether you are already wet, which again is going to be the value of 1, or have you just become wet now? So by saying wetness, the maximum of these two values. We could even break this out into a separate line to make this a little easier to see. So we could say float phi equals this, wetness phi. So again, so this is doing the thing it was already doing, is are you wet right now? And this is saying, what's bigger, that you're wet right now or that you were at least wet previously? So in this way, this effect will accumulate now over frames. So you can see how it's building up like so. We never lose wetness now. It's always just getting bigger. So that's something. I would also, I think I'm going to reconsider something I said earlier. Just based on this first frame here. No, I guess this is right. Never mind that. So moving on from that. So it's getting bigger and bigger. It's getting more and more wet. Nothing is ever not becoming wet. I would like to see some evaporation or it trickles down back into the water or something. So we should say, no matter what for this last thing, we should always be removing wetness from everything, every frame. So we say wetness times equals some scaling factor, like so. This scaling factor should be fairly large. If it's 1, then obviously it doesn't change and it behaves the way it currently does. If I were to say something like 0.5, it's going to lose half of its wetness on every frame. So now we see some of this white area here. So that's kind of that residual streaking that we're talking about. As the wave comes down, it's still a little bit wet. The thing is, there's 24 frames in a second, and this is going to run by default with only one substep, once per frame, 24 times in a second. So it's going to decimate the wetness by half that many times. It's probably too much. So try going somewhere really high and see what that gets us. In fact, I'm going to just say, let's try 0.96 and see what this gets us. because we want it to stick around a little bit. It's already going to be drying unnaturally fast. So we might as well let it stick around a little bit longer. So let's see what that does. I'll let that run for a little bit, and then we'll look at it. And here's the result of that. Brick's pretty cool. You can still see that it is evaporating fairly fast. Or again, if not technically evaporating, it's falling. Let's say the water is falling back into the ocean or the river or whatever it is. So that's pretty good. I'm a little concerned that maybe we should be using the voxel size instead of the particle separation. Let's keep it at particle size or particle separation for now. I don't know. I feel like it's a little broken up here, and I'd rather overshoot it a little bit than be undersized on it. So before we actually cache it, I'm going to shoot from the hip on this one and say, let's use the voxel size instead. There you go. So now, technically it'll reach out a little bit farther, but it's still such a small amount that I don't think anyone will notice. But we will be assured that we are marking things wet, and that's what I want. I don't want there to be gaps as liquid skips over something. Cool. So that's it. So that's the wet map. All we really needed is that wetness attribute, and we need to have these files saved to disk. We'll put a null here, although technically this isn't rendered. This will be read by the shader only. So let's save this out. And actually, before we save it, let's continue our reign of terror over here in the out kingdom. We'll say this should be a fetch wet map static, and that will point to exactly that. So you should be used to this by now. Make sure you get them in the right order, though. We need the static one to happen first, and then and this one will rely on the static for dynamic. And there you go. And now this is the dynamic one. And now this can also come back into this merge thing here. Cool. I'm just going to disable these. We're going to keep these for later. Again, if we ever need to do everything at once, we can turn them on and run it all. Cool. So now we have 3 parallel streams that you could potentially do. Cool. So save this to disk, and then we can actually move on to the shading of it.